tous et merci de suivre La Grande H, l'émission d'histoire du média. Aujourd'hui, nous sommes avec Gray Anderson. Bonjour Gray Anderson.
Bonjour.
Merci d'être avec nous. Gray Anderson est l'auteur d'un livre récemment paru qui s'appelle La guerre civile en France, 1958-1962, du coup d'État gaulliste à la fin de l'OAS. Ce livre relate les événements qui ont vu la naissance de la Cinquième République, celle sous le régime de laquelle nous vivons aujourd'hui encore. Gray Anderson est actuellement chercheur à l'université de Caen. Son livre a été traduit aux éditions de la Fabrique par Éric Hazan lui-même, le directeur des éditions de la Fabrique. C'est particulièrement intéressant pour un lecteur français de lire cette histoire des années 1958-1962. D'abord parce que c'est un regard extérieur, celui d'un chercheur états-unien sur l'histoire de France. Donc il y a une forme de recul, une forme de décalage très intéressante pour un Français. Ensuite parce que ces événements qui sont assez proches dans le temps, dont les effets, la naissance de la Cinquième République, sont encore très importants pour notre présent, et structurent encore notre présent, comme les institutions de la Cinquième République structurent la vie politique française. Mais en même temps, on a largement oublié ce qui s'est passé pendant cette période, et les circonstances qui ont présidé à la naissance de la Cinquième République pendant cette période ont, dans une large mesure, disparu. La guerre d'Algérie, le problème de l'existence de millions d'Européens qui sont installés en Algérie et qui veulent que l'Algérie reste française, c'est quelque chose qui n'appartient plus du tout à notre présent. Et c'est pourtant un élément capital sans lequel on ne comprend pas la naissance de la Cinquième République. Donc c'est quelque chose qui est à la fois loin, qui est devenu étrange, et proche, puisque le fruit de cette période, c'est les institutions d'aujourd'hui. Dans votre livre, vous évoquez une citation de Sartre au moment où le régime se met en place, après le putsch donc du 13 mai 1958. Sartre dit « Le régime gaulliste sentira jusqu'à sa fin et dans toutes ses manifestations l'arbitraire et la violence dont il est issu. » Alors, on peut espérer que cette prophétie ne se réalisera pas de manière trop concrète. Ça fait maintenant plus de 2 mois que le mouvement des Gilets jaunes secoue la vie politique française. Et ce qui ressort de ce mouvement, dans une large mesure, c'est une demande de démocratie. Le sentiment que les institutions de la Cinquième République ne sont pas suffisamment représentatives, qu'il y a un très gros déficit de représentativité avec, depuis peut-être sans doute déjà plusieurs quinquennats, un pouvoir qui s'efforce de convertir la société française à des formes sociales néolibérales, avec un accroissement des inégalités, dont elle ne veut pas, mais qui est néanmoins en mesure de les imposer du fait des institutions. C'est donc d'autant plus intéressant de se dire, mais au fait, dans quelles circonstances ont émergé les institutions qui sont les nôtres et qui sont si décriées. Le livre se présente comme un récit assez simple, et on peut peut-être commencer comme ça, tout simplement, en évoquant ces événements dans une large mesure oubliés entre le début de l'année 1958 et la fin de l'année 1962, de cette guerre civile qui a créé la Cinquième République.
Yes, so in February 1958, an international crisis is unleashed by French airstrikes against the Tunisian village of Saket, across the border with Algeria, which leave a number of civilian casualties, great deal of destruction, are condemned notably by the American and British governments, which propose in turn mediation in a diplomatic crisis involving not just France and its territories in North Africa, but also the newly independent Tunisia. This interference of the Anglo-Saxon powers in French affairs is seen to be intolerable by many forces within Parliament. It ultimately provokes the fall of a government, that of Félix Gaillard, and institutes what is typically held to be the terminal crisis, the endgame of the post-war republic, the Fourth Republic. Now, the date which I center on in my book, and which is a kind of conventional signifier of this implosion of the Fourth Republic, is May 13th. May 13th, 1958, a massive demonstration of settlers in Algiers leads to the seizure of the major government building, the Gouvernement Général, the civilian authority in the Algerian capital, by a group of these pieds noirs, together with a number of officers, including General Jacques Massu, commander of the army in the capital, renowned for his role in the Battle of Algiers the previous year. So this group of insurgents, having occupied the facilities, declared Comité de salut public civil et militaire and demanded that a new government be formed in Paris under General Charles de Gaulle, committed to the protection of French sovereignty over the Algerian département.
C'est-à-dire que ceux qui prennent le pouvoir, donc, en Algérie, des militaires, des civils, demandent un gouvernement de Gaulle.
Exactly, yes, so already there are those in the night of May 13th and May 14th, as Parliament is voting the investiture of the Christian Democratic politician Pierre Flamelin, held in suspicion by the hardcore defenders of French colonial authority in Algeria for his supposed liberal views. There are already those on May 13th who are looking to a Gaullist solution.
Donc on a peur que Flamelin et son nouveau gouvernement finissent par accepter l'indépendance de l'Algérie?
Exactly that. It's worried that a Flamelin administration will pursue liberal reforms leading to a bradage de l'Algérie.
Est-ce qu'on peut rappeler alors à ce moment-là, pourquoi de Gaulle? Qui est de Gaulle? Bien sûr, on connaît ce personnage, mais à ce moment-là, comment est-ce qu'il apparaît? Il n'est plus au pouvoir depuis pas mal de temps, mais si j'ai bien lu votre livre, ça fait pas mal d'années qu'il s'agite lui-même et qu'on s'agite autour de lui pour éventuellement le ramener au pouvoir.
Precisely that. So in the historiography, there's a cliché, I suppose, of the 1950s, which describes the activity of de Gaulle and his followers in terms of a traversée du désert, a biblical metaphor implying that de Gaulle was a kind of prophet in the wilderness, a Cassandra of the Fourth Republic, who retreated to his village to write his memoirs, released in the 50s, of course, to great success, but who had withdrawn from politics. In fact, as we know, and as I try to show, his closest allies, notably Olivier Guichard, the head of his cabinet, and Jacques Faucard, who is the general secretary of the RPF, the post-war Gaullist party.
Le Rassemblement pour la France, hein, c'est ça?
Precisely that. In fact, kept the general closely informed of the terminal shocks that afflicted France's post-war governments, from Dien Bien Phu, let's say, in 1954, leading to defeat in Indochina, humiliation at Suez, and then the turmoil that surrounded the Algerian conflict, an undeclared war beginning at the 1st November, of course, of 1954.
Si on veut bien se repérer, il faut rappeler qu'à la libération, de Gaulle est au pouvoir, mais que rapidement, il va quitter le pouvoir en 1946, si je me souviens bien, parce que la forme que les institutions prennent à ce moment-là ne lui conviennent pas.
Precisely that, yes. So de Gaulle left power decrying the system of the parties, which had been re-established in a sense after the episode of Vichy and the Occupation, and what he saw to be an insufficiency of executive power and leadership in the constitutional arrangements of the Fourth Republic. He duly formed his own party, as we've mentioned, the RPF, entered opposition and pursued for a time a parliamentary route to power. The RPF did enjoy victory and initial victory, some legislative success, but was ultimately outflanked by the coalition parties of what was called the Third Force. So from 1953 or so, it becomes clear to de Gaulle and to his closest supporters that a conventional parliamentary investiture is unlikely to be his road back to the head of affairs, but rather, as he put it in a speech to the RPF in 1953, a grave crisis or national catastrophe of some sort would be necessary. So from 1953, let's say, de Gaulle and his intimates have a close eye out for the source of that crisis, which, as it transpires, presents itself in Algiers.
Cette crise, elle va survenir avec les problèmes de la décolonisation. Il faut bien avoir en tête qu'à l'époque, la France est encore à la tête d'un empire colonial dont la plupart des composantes sont en train de s'émanciper d'une manière plus ou moins violente, avec plus ou moins de résistance de la part du pouvoir métropolitain. Vous racontez bien comment, après Dien Bien Phu, il y a de premiers appels pressants à De Gaulle, cette défaite absolument humiliante pour l'armée française et pour la République française face aux colonisés d'Indochine. Et puis donc, c'est le problème énorme de l'Algérie qui va être cette crise que De Gaulle et les gaullistes attendent. Est-ce qu'on peut dire 2 mots sur les spécificités de l'Algérie comme colonie, sans quoi on ne comprend pas bien les données du problème?
Absolutely. So, as I think is known, but it's worth recalling, Algeria, unlike the protectorates of Tunisia or Morocco, was considered to be part of mainland France. Administratively, the Algerian départements were départements just as the mainland regions were. And so, in a sense, Algeria was seen to be inalienable in a way that France's other overseas possessions were not.
Au même moment, la Tunisie, le Maroc, par exemple, pour en rester à des pays limitrophes, obtiennent des autonomies jusqu'à l'indépendance. Mais l'Algérie, c'est spécial, ça n'a pas du tout le même statut. Et la raison pour laquelle ça n'a pas du tout le même statut, c'est que c'est une colonie de peuplement, c'est ça?
Exactly that. And I think one can keep in mind that in 1954, 1955, even liberal figures on colonial issues such as Pierre Mendès France or François Mitterrand, although advocating a withdrawal from Indochina and a greater margin of maneuver or freedom, autonomy for the protectorates in the Maghreb, insisted there was no possibility of granting independence to Algeria. Algeria was really a special case.
À cause du fait qu'il y avait des millions de Français, on les appelait les Européens par opposition aux musulmans, qui étaient implantés depuis plusieurs générations, souvent, et qui mettaient en valeur des terres qui avaient été prises au 19e siècle, au début du 20e siècle, aux indigènes.
Exactly that. So following the colonization in 1830, French presence had been deeply implanted in Algeria and was represented in France by both political parties and a powerful colonial lobby with agrarian interests in the territory and, importantly, from 1956, interest in Algerian natural resources.
Il y a un autre élément quand même qu'il faut mettre en place, là encore, pour bien comprendre ce qui se passe, c'est que la population indigène, les Algériens, se trouve depuis les débuts de la colonisation en position subordonnés. Beaucoup d'Algériens ont été spoliés de leurs terres. Ils sont soumis à un régime juridique qui est celui de l'indigénat. Il y a une inégalité de droit. En tout cas, longtemps, il y a eu cette inégalité de droit et elle prévaut encore de facto au moment où se déclenche la guerre d'Algérie. Il y a donc un mouvement nationaliste algérien qui s'engage dans une guerre d'indépendance juste au moment où la France perd l'Indochine.
Exactly that. So news reaches Paris that Dien Bien Phu has fallen early May 1954. Pierre Mendès France, in the governmental crisis that issues from this defeat, comes to power with a promise to bring an end to the conflict in Indochina, to resolve another outstanding source of controversy for the Fourth Republic, which concerns the project for a European army. The EDC, extremely unpopular in military circles, denounced by the Gaullist formation. And Mendès France accomplishes these goals. His tenure in office is relatively short. And when the hostilities in Algeria break out in November 54, it's really a shock for opinion in mainland France. And you can see that it's not really what happened. It takes a while, in fact, for politicians and for the media to recognize what's happened.
Et comment est-ce qu'on peut expliquer, en quelques mots, ce soulèvement de 1954?
There's a situation of colonial oppression, which is brutal, which is keenly felt, and despite a series of attempts at liberal reform to counteract the harder-core revanchist line of big landowners and the kind of right wing of the colonial elite, little progress is made in fact. So, in a sense, these liberal reformist visions really rested more on rhetoric than on reality.
Il y avait une très forte résistance, si je comprends bien, des populations européennes, françaises, des colons en Algérie, à un ajustement, à une montée des droits des indigènes.
In fact, those in mainland France who attempted to conceive of different kind of solutions to pacify unrest on the part of so-called indigenous Algerians, residents of Algeria, often expressed frustration at the obstinacy of the Pied Noir population and their political leadership, reluctant to make any concession concerning their racial and political privilege in those territories.
Quand la guerre d'Algérie commence donc à la fin de l'année 1954, et pendant ces 4 premières années de la guerre, est-ce qu'en France, il y a des courants, à gauche en particulier, qui soutiennent l'indépendance de l'Algérie, ou est-ce qu'ils sont très minoritaires?
It's an important question because it touches on the attitude of the French Communist Party, which is notoriously contradictory, ambiguous on this subject, does not come out, we can put it this way, forthrightly for independence from the get-go. Notoriously, Maurice Thorez, leader of the party, refers to an Algerian nation in formation, but which, perhaps whose time has perhaps not yet come. This does change. So from 57 or so, the French Communist Party, in fact, does explicitly take a stand for independence, but it remains the only major political formation to do so. And one can recall that from 1947, the PCF, despite being a considerable electoral force, the largest party in France, is excluded from the mainstream of electoral politics and from government. And so in a sense, if you consider the mainstream of bourgeois politics, although there are nuances, one can say that there's a kind of consensus prevailing that independence, in any case, has to be excluded. Now, within that consensus, there are attempts to carve out different degrees of compromise. Early in 1956, Guy Mollet takes power at the head of what was known as the Republican Front. He's supported, in fact, by many on the left who believe that he will lead a government committed to a more liberal policy in Algeria. It quite quickly becomes clear that's not going to be the case. There's an episode early in 56, shortly after taking office, when Mollet arrives in Algiers and is jeered by settler protesters, pelted with produce. It's known as the Journée des Tomates. It's not clear, in fact, if tomatoes were amongst the vegetables. In any case, he's shocked by this reception, and very soon thereafter, one witnesses a turn to the right, a hardening of tone, and the demand that any negotiations with pro-independence forces in Algeria be contingent upon a ceasefire, a demand which, for I think evident reasons, was seen to be unacceptable by the National Liberation Front, the leadership of the Algerian independence movement.
Donc même pour la gauche de gouvernement, si je comprends bien, l'Algérie, c'est la France.
Absolutely, yes.
Alors donc ce fameux 13 mai 1958, c'est une situation de putsch en Algérie, de coup d'État en quelque sorte.
You have a declaration of military authority over the Algerian territories and a demand on the part of officers that a new government be constituted in Paris.
En France, c'est ça.
Precisely that. At the moment that Parliament is voting to invest Pierre Flamelin.
Et quelle est la réaction des autorités de métropole, précisément, à ce putsch, cette tentative de putsch?
So the coup d'etat of May 13th in Algiers finds the government in Paris, which ultimately wins its investiture. That is to say, Pierre Flamelin is installed as président du Conseil in a vote in the early hours of May 14th. The event finds Parliament in disarray. There's a degree of confusion, reluctance to engage in a head-to-head confrontation with the military in Algeria. Ultimately, it's decided, in a sense, to acquiesce to the fait accompli of this Machtergreifung, the seizure of power, in recognizing the legality post facto of military supremacy in Algiers.
Et on fait mine, finalement, de choisir de donner les pouvoirs civils aux militaires en Algérie?
Precisely that, yes. So the choice, as it's construed in Paris, is essentially between a denunciation of this power grab by soldiers and the construction of a popular front or a united front, which necessarily would include communist participation. This is what the PCF calls for at the time. Or acquiescence, in a sense, to the facts on the ground as they present themselves in Algiers. And so the political elite, unwilling to engage in an alliance with the Communist Party, haunted or invested by deep-rooted anti-communism, Cold War anti-communism, is equally unwilling to consider what was described at the time as a kind of Spanish Civil War without a Republican army. So what you find is an impasse, an extremely difficult scenario in which effectively the legal, legitimate government in France hedges its bets, equivocates, and de facto recognizes what the militaires have brought about in the Algerian capital.
Le pouvoir civil, finalement, ne tient plus les militaires, en tout cas, doute de la loyauté de l'armée, y compris en France?
Precisely that. So in fact, there are actually fears and arrests carried out on May 14th and in the following days as the government tracks down officers thought to be suspect in their loyalties, preparing in fact a seizure of power in the mainland.
Finalement, Fimelin ne va pas tenir bien longtemps. Il va suffire de 15 jours pour que De Gaulle, effectivement, revienne selon les vœux des putschistes.
I think the crucial dates in May that we can identify, on the 15th, General Raoul Salan, who's the commander-in-chief of French forces in all of Algeria, himself appears before the Forum in Algiers and calls on de Gaulle to form a government, echoing the appeal that had been issued 2 days prior. De Gaulle himself issues an ambiguous public statement, but breaks silence, which he had maintained in the years prior. On May 19th, he holds a press conference, hotly anticipated in Paris, and essentially declares himself available as savior of the faltering republic, and refuses to condemn the actions of the soldiers in Algiers on the grounds, perhaps reasonable enough, that the government itself had refrained from denouncing this open act of insubordination. And at the end of the month, under the constant threat of a military landing in Paris, of parachutists from the southwest of France, from Corsica and Algeria arriving, descending on the Palais Bourbon to take matters in hand, Parliament ultimately votes to invest de Gaulle as the final président du Conseil of the Fourth Republic.
Mais De Gaulle a mis des conditions.
Precisely that. Among the concessions, most notably, he demanded plein pouvoir and the empowerment to draft a new constitution to be submitted to the public in a referendum vote the following autumn.
Quelle est la suite des événements? Comment est-ce que cette constitution va entrer en vigueur?
So the constitution is in fact drafted very hastily in almost total secrecy by a committee of experts. It's unveiled, the text is unveiled September 4th, 1958 in a grand public ceremony, stage managed by André Malraux. And it's put to a vote on September 28th. Massively approved, 80% of the population votes in favor of its adoption.
Un référendum, donc. Hein?
Precisely this, right? A referendum. At the end of September 1958, it's promulgated on October 4th, and the Fifth Republic soon proclaimed. The text of 1958 had an important ambiguity concerning the locus of executive power. So it's what's sometimes called it's a bicephalous constitution, which has a president elected by a collège de notables, not elected by a universal suffrage, and a prime minister who is the head of government. And it's not entirely clear juridically on the basis of the text where the real power lies. Needless to say, over the ensuing 4 years, this becomes quite clear, and the presidentialization of the Fifth Republic is consecrated, perhaps we'll come back to this, in another referendum in 1962, after the end of hostilities in Algeria.
Ce texte constitutionnel est conforme à ce que De Gaulle, depuis la fin de la Seconde Guerre mondiale, réclame en termes d'institution. Elle est censée, cette constitution, éviter les désordres liés au parlementarisme, au règne des partis, selon la vulgate gaulliste.
Yes, and it's sometimes described as an expression of what was called rationalized parliamentarism, expression favored by Michel Debré, one of its most important architects, of of course, the first prime minister of the Fifth Republic. And one can overstate, I think, the extent to which this text reflects de Gaulle's own views, the sense in which he could be called a prophet of the Fifth Republic. The expression is that of the political scientist Brigitte Gaëti, who's shown, in fact, that the Constitution really emerges out of a kind of compromise, and it reflects influences that can be charted back at least to the 1930s. So there's a strain of conservative thought, pioneered notably by André Tardieu, which sought for some time to transfer power away from Parliament, seen to be dysfunctional, inadapté, faced with the economic, military, political challenges of the mid-20th century, and invest them instead in this executive authority. It's true that it's not until the advent of the Fifth Republic that we see the realization of this doctrine of executive reform, and in a sense also its legitimation as a sort of philosophy of government, which we can remember in a sense was contrary to a republican tradition stretching back to the 18th century and construed throughout the great social upheavals of the 19th century as a kind of Bonapartism, as a road to dictatorship, as an expression of personal power to be avoided at all costs. So there is, at very least, a symbolic revolution entailed in the imposition of this new constitution and newly empowered executive that it's difficult, I think, to overstate.
Même si les circonstances dans lesquelles De Gaulle et les gaullistes se sont trouvés en position d'écrire cette constitution sont des circonstances de putsch, hein, on a forcé très clairement la main avec la menace de guerre civile aux parlementaires, aux partis de gouvernement, pour laisser De Gaulle écrire cette constitution. Et, comme vous l'avez dit, elle est ratifiée très massivement donc, à la fin du mois de septembre 1958 en France. On s'en remet à De Gaulle, hein, on approuve massivement la nouvelle constitution. Et pourtant, votre livre s'appelle « La guerre civile en France ». Ça n'est que le début d'une période extrêmement trouble sur laquelle plane le spectre de cette possibilité de guerre civile qui déchirerait le pays. Pourquoi est-ce que les problèmes ne font que commencer finalement quand cette constitution est adoptée?
So the title I chose, I realize is somewhat controversial, and I've been asked, what exactly, to what extent it's fair to describe this period from 58 to 62 as one characterized by civil war. And to me it seems in one respect obvious, that is to say, the conflict in Algeria, insofar as the Algerian départements were part of mainland France, was by definition a civil war. I think you see in the interregnum period between de Gaulle's return and the consolidation of new institutions in 62, with the end of the Algerian War, is a kind of metastasization of the conflict, affecting quite dramatically on certain occasions. Here I think, for instance, of the street massacres of late 1961, Charonne, the attacks of the OAS in France, comes to affect the mainland very directly. So I think it's a period in which the normal course of French politics takes place under the shadow of the violence which has consumed Algerian society and begun to strike at the mainland itself.
Ceux qui ont fait le putsch de 1958 aux côtés des partisans de Gaulle, c'est-à-dire les ultras d'Algérie qui veulent le maintien de la domination coloniale française en l'État, mais aussi l'extrême droite française dans son ensemble, largement d'héritage vichiste, ces gens-là ne vont pas être satisfaits de la politique menée par De Gaulle à partir du moment où il prend le pouvoir grâce à leur aide.
I think you can see some real kind of contradictions between the forces that returned De Gaulle to power. De Gaulle was never terribly popular in the army. Since the 30s, a figure of controversy. The French armed forces were overwhelmingly loyal to Vichy, traumatized by the épuration after the war and the integration of the Free French forces into the regular army. And nor is he terribly popular with the Pieds Noirs, the settlers in Algeria, who themselves likewise are strongly marked by pétainisme and suspicious of l'homme du 18 juin. They settle on De Gaulle in the end precisely in the hope that he alone will be capable of defending French dominion over the Algerian département and leading the kind of Algerian policy which they hoped for.
Et là, il y a un malentendu, il y a une ambiguïté que De Gaulle a entretenue au départ. Il a laissé penser, si je comprends bien, à l'extrême droite et aux ultras d'Algérie, qu'il allait prendre le pouvoir pour maintenir l'Algérie en France.
Exactly that. And there's long been debate over what de Gaulle's real intentions were on returning to power. And there, I think ambiguity has to be accepted as the right word, in the sense that he simply said different things to different people. To associates on the left, anti-colonial militants, he let it be thought that he was in fact devoted to the independence of France's remaining possessions in North Africa. To others, notoriously on his first visit to Algeria, his "vous ai compris,"
Je vous ai compris.
Addressed to the settlers.
La route que vous avez ouverte en Algérie, c'est celle de la rénovation et de la fraternité.
Qu'est-ce qu'il avait compris exactement?
Right, notoriously
Personne ne sait ce qu'il avait compris.
So the debate, I mean, there's been a debate over what his real intentions were, and assuming that he wasn't resolved on independence firmly on returning to power in May 58 already, when exactly it was that he had a kind of change of mind, a change of heart. There are a few candidates in the historiography. I think one often looks to his speech in 1959, September 1959, in which he envisioned for the first time publicly self-determination.
Ce qui était quelque chose de tabou pour les forces coloniales et les forces d'extrême droite françaises qu'il avait amené au pouvoir.
It's a grave shock, yes, it's a grave shock. I mean, this is, you can see really there already are hints at discontent, dissatisfaction on the part of those who helped bring de Gaulle to power with his policy, uncertainty. I think from the autumn of 59, you see that malaise start to build. So he promises that there will be, at some unspecified date in the future, a vote on the destiny of Algeria, and he proposes three different possibilities, one being maintenance of the status quo, the other being independence, the third being some vague form of association, continued association with France, clearly being the solution that he favored.
Ce qui est inacceptable pour, encore une fois, les forces qui ont fait le putsch du 13 mai 58 et qui ont porté de Gaulle au pouvoir. En tout cas, pour une partie de ces forces.
Yes, I would say, yeah, for certainly for some elements among those who helped bring de Gaulle to power, both in the settler population, on the part of hardline colonialists in France, and within the army, this hint at self-determination and the prospect of independence, which comes into view really in the autumn of 59, is abhorrent.
Et c'est ça finalement qui explique ce climat de guerre civile larvée qui va se développer, enfin qui va continuer à se développer à ce moment-là.
Exactly this. So I think it's indecision, it's ambiguity concerning de Gaulle's objectives that triggers in what you see as a kind of series of episodes, a series of attempts really to replay May 1958. So those who see themselves as having been disappointed by the figure whom they helped to install in 58 will rise up again and attempt, in a sense, to do things over with a different outcome. You see this in January 1960 in what's known as the Affair of the Barricades in Algiers, in which settler leaders, with the complicity of important parts of the army, stage a short-lived insurrection, barricade off parts of the Algerian capital. You see it again quite spectacularly in the spring of 61 with the generals' putsch in Algiers in April. But ultimately, these attempts fail.
Cette fois-ci, le putsch de 1961 donc, dont vous parliez, il est clairement vécu comme un putsch, contrairement à ce qui se passe le 13 mai 1958. Le pouvoir civil n'essaie pas, disons, de rattraper les choses en approuvant ce que font les putschistes. Là, c'est clairement une tentative de coup d'État de la part de ces quatre généraux. Et finalement, c'est la première et unique fois que l'article 16, si spécifique de la Constitution de 1958, a été mis en œuvre par de Gaulle.
Absolutely. I think there, with the April 1961 putsch, one really sees the interconnection between the crises, serial crises produced by the Algerian conflict and the transformation of state power in France and its intensification, the arrogation of executive power in France. So Article 16 of the Constitution, as you mentioned, is an extraordinary emergency powers clause granting nigh uncontrolled authority to the president to proceed as he sees fit in under conditions of grave national crisis. These are the powers invoked in April 61 to some controversy, but it's a temptation. The temptation of Article 16 is in fact constantly present. You see de Gaulle, he toyed with the idea already in January 1960 in response to the barricades insurgents, and it's something which remains in the background of his calculations.
Qu'est-ce qui s'est passé pendant cette semaine des barricades de 1960? Comment ça s'est terminé? Qu'est-ce qui s'est passé en avril 1961? Comment s'est déroulé ce putsch et comment est-ce qu'il s'est terminé?
So the roots of the week of the barricades are to be found with an interview given by General Massu, that is to say, the commander still of the army in Algiers, who had played so prominent a role in May 1958, who gives an interview to a German journalist expressing, and this is in early 1960, right, so months after de Gaulle's speech in which he made reference to the prospect of self-determination, Massu in his interview reflects on the disappointment of some in the army with the apparently liberal tendency, increasingly visible liberal tendency of the head of state. He said memorably, "We were shocked to discover that de Gaulle was a man of the left." This interview scandalizes Paris when news arrives. De Gaulle insists that Massu be immediately relieved of his functions. He's recalled to the capital. A replacement is found. And this rappel à l'ordre of a popular, charismatic military commander is a bitter shock to the Pied Noir community and to much of the armed forces, and triggers then the uprising in January, which involves notably a direct confrontation between gendarmes in Algiers and these Pied Noir ultras, which leaves a number of gendarmes dead and intensifies this lingering sense, fear, dread of civil war. It concretizes it.
Mais l'armée ne se lance pas à ce moment-là dans une logique subversive, alors que c'est ce qui se passe donc en avril 1961.
That's right, yes. So in April 1961, following, it bears saying, a speech by de Gaulle in which he for the first time invokes an economic rationale for prospective decolonization. He refers to Algeria costing more than it brings France, a logic familiar for those who had been reading the French press from a kind of right-wing case for decolonization made by the journalist Raymond Cartier or Raymond Aron in the previous years, but which de Gaulle himself had never voiced before.
Et ça veut dire qu'en fait, l'indépendance est très sérieusement envisagée, donc.
Precisely. And this is what unleashes a kind of a conspiracy which had been brewing for some time and which involves a number of senior figures, notably the four generals who ultimately carry it out. Among them, Raoul Salan, former commander-in-chief, as well as Maurice Charles, his successor in Algeria, who think that they will in fact be able to replay May 58 and to impose their will on the civilian administration at home.
Quels sont leurs objectifs politiques alors? Puisque l'armée fait de la politique, donc comme depuis le 13 mai 58, il est clair que l'armée considère qu'elle a un rôle politique à jouer. En tout cas, cette part très importante de l'armée qui est engagée dans des logiques subversives.
There, I think it's important to distinguish between the most politicized and militant elements of the officer corps, which is not a majority, it has to be said. It's a vocal minority, nonetheless prepared to pass into action, which is resolutely committed to avoiding what is seen in the French army of the late 50s and early 60s as betrayal in Indochina. So there's a kind of stab in the back legend, which is quite influential within the professional elite of the French army in the 1950s, which sees basically politicians in Paris as having betrayed the French expeditionary force in Southeast Asia. Although that activist element can't be said to be a majority, it's charismatic and enjoys some degree of support from soldiers who are confused concerning the policy, the rationale for their engagement in Algeria, which is dragged on for so long, and are seeking clarity on the part of political leadership.
Et alors, qu'est-ce qu'il demande, ce carteron de généraux en retraite, comme de Gaulle va les appeler, avec mépris?
So concretely, what they're demanding is a guarantee, a concrete guarantee that no concessions will be made once again to Algerian independence, that French presence will be protected. There's some speculation at the time that they were hopeful of having support from from foreign powers, possibly the US, rather a fanciful idea, but it seems that figures involved in the putsch at least may have been convinced this was possible. And, I think in retrospect, it's quite clear that they stood little chance of succeeding. So although elements of the army in Algeria do in fact, notably the elite airborne divisions, parts of the Foreign Legion, do support the putsch, the majority of conscript soldiers are looking forward mainly to completing their military service and heading home. There are episodes famously of actual insubordination against the putschist leaders on the part of the contingent. And in Paris, although you have some officers, cabals, which are prepared to aid the putschists across the Mediterranean, the majority of the armed forces and certainly the political establishment has no real appetite for this sort of upheaval.
De Gaulle s'en sort, donc les généraux sont obligés de céder.
That's right. So de Gaulle takes the opportunity to give a famous speech, one of his more remarkable episodes of oratory in which he deplores, as one knows, a carteron des généraux en retraite.
Un pouvoir insurrectionnel s'est établi en Algérie par un prononciamento militaire. Les coupables de l'usurpation ont exploité la passion des cadres de certaines unités spéciales, l'adhésion enflammée d'une partie de la population de souche européenne, égarée de craintes et de mythes, l'impuissance des responsables submergés par la conjuration militaire. Ce pouvoir a une apparence, un carteron de généraux en retraite. Il a une réalité, un groupe d'officiers partisans, ambitieux et fanatiques. Leur entreprise ne peut conduire qu'à un désastre national.
They, before too long, realize that there's little political backing for their project in France. Maurice Charles, notably, and André Zeller, one of the other generals, reject plans which were proposed by Raoul Salan and their accomplices to mobilize the Pied Noir population and in a sense, enroll the civilian population, the European civilian population of Algeria in a protracted standoff with the authorities in Paris. The putsch is disbanded, Charles surrenders, Zeller is swiftly arrested, Salan and Jouot take flight. And there another chapter opens in the history of what an organization founded earlier that year, but which soon becomes famous, rather notorious, the Secret Army Organization.
L'OAS.
L'OAS, which has at its head General Salan himself.
Cette organisation de l'armée secrète, c'est elle, en particulier, qui va déterminer l'existence de cette guerre civile larvée qui se poursuit jusqu'en 1962.
Yes, I think, and it's not an exaggeration, to describe the ambition of the Secret Army Organization, insofar as it had one, as essentially waging a kind of civil war, which in effect is what it does. I mean, with a great deal of violence in Algeria, but also notoriously, spectacularly attacks in mainland France as well. It has to be said that in turn this generates a response on the part of the authorities, who themselves intensify a kind of practice of state violence and of control on two fronts. And this, I think, is a really important kind of dynamic. It's very well described by the historian Alain de Verbe in his book on the Charonne massacre. What you see is the police and civil administration in Paris struggling at one and the same time against the more vocal and committed advocates on the left for independence, represented in the anti-colonial student movement within the Communist Party, who engage in an increasingly vocal public campaign of criticism of the war from 1959, 1960 on, and at the same time against the OIS and the right. And, one episode, one culmination of this two-pronged strategy is the October 1961 massacres of peaceful Algerian protesters in Paris by the police. The figures are still contested, but it seems clear at least 100 or so Algerians are killed throughout the month of October, bodies dumped in the Seine. This is a brutal act of repression, which was authorized, we now know, from the highest levels. So this was a strategy of policing undertaken by the Parisian prefect, Maurice Papon, with the approval of his superiors, which, among other things, sought to pacify or give a kind of guarantee to those on the right most upset by the ongoing tendency, the drift towards a kind of liberal quietus to the occupation in Algeria.
D'un côté, il y a la guerre de l'OAS, mais de l'autre côté, il y a aussi la guerre contre les Algériens, contre les indépendantistes algériens ou contre la population algérienne en France, potentiellement soutenant le FLN.
Yes, that's right. And in that conflict, I mean, the crucial problem, I think, for de Gaulle and Debre's government is that they are unsure as to whether they can rely upon the appareil dur de l'État, that is to say, the hardcore of repressive apparatuses, the police, the gendarmerie, the army, all of which are shot through with sympathies for the colonialist forces in Algeria. And so one way, and this is the thesis presented by de Verbe, one way of looking at the massacres of 1961 and at the savage repression of pro-independence forces both in France and in Algeria is as a kind of sop to those within the forces of order who are uncertain, are vacillating, whose morale is open to question. I think it can be added here, I'll just mention that it's this uncertainty concerning the reliability of the hard core of the state that is also responsible for the rise of parallel police, of the notorious barbus, of agents contracted to engage in the struggle against the OIS because the army in Algeria and elements in mainland France were thought that they could not be counted on to carry out that mission.
Et donc on trouve là l'origine de cette tradition française, en tout cas de cette pratique du pouvoir d'État en France, des barbouzes, c'est-à-dire de l'action parallèle par des polices plus ou moins informelles. Et ça, on sait bien que c'est encore quelque chose qui marque notre présent très contemporain, après avoir marqué toute l'histoire de la Cinquième République, bien après cette guerre civile larvée de 1958-1962. Si on continue le récit, malgré tout, de Gaulle a choisi l'indépendance de l'Algérie, ou plutôt a compris qu'elle était inéluctable et décide de la mettre en œuvre. On en arrive en 1962 aux accords d'Évian avec le FLN, qui programme l'indépendance de l'Algérie pour le début de l'été, dans un climat de guerre civile.
Yeah, and what I think can be stressed here is that in the end, as the Évian Accords are signed, France walks away with almost none of the objectives to which de Gaulle and the government had clung for so long. That is to say, in a sense, this is really a kind of defeat, and the question has to be posed why this kind of peace couldn't have been signed 2 years earlier. This is an element, I mean, it's an element of controversy, but part of the case, I think, critical of de Gaulle for his handling of the war. At the same time, once the peace is signed, the OAS does not cease its activities by any stretch of the imagination, but in fact escalates. And so in the spring of 1962, there's a kind of scorched earth campaign to destroy as much as possible of Algerian civilization, infrastructure, in anticipation of independence. And so you see there's a kind of fateful breach is reached when OAS commandos open fire on the army itself. And there one realizes, in a sense, that they've gone too far. I mean, it's the sort of beginning of the end. But that climate of violence that accompanies the last months of the Algerian War doesn't disappear with the achievement of independence, which is voted by the French, of course, in a referendum in April of 1962, declared in Algeria at the beginning of July. But it hangs over French politics, and I think has to be taken into consideration in understanding the great modification, decisive modification of the 1958 constitutional text, which forms the sort of bookend or justifies my chronological frame from 58 to 62. And that is, of course, the referendum providing for direct election of the president by universal suffrage.
Pour maintenir et pour affermir dans l'avenir nos institutions face à toutes les entreprises factieuses, de quelque côté qu'elles viennent, et aussi aux manœuvres de ceux qui, de bonne ou de mauvaise foi, voudraient nous ramener au funeste système d'antan, je crois devoir faire au pays la proposition que voici. Quand sera terminé mon propre septennat, ou, si la mort ou la maladie l'interrompait avant le terme, le président de la République sera dorénavant élu au suffrage universel.
L'élection du président de la République au suffrage universel, qui n'était pas inséré au départ dans la Constitution de 1958, vous l'avez rappelé, le président était élu par un collège d'à peu près 80 000 notables, hein, c'est ça, par tous les parlementaires, donc députés, sénateurs, par les conseillers régionaux et par les conseillers municipaux. C'était une élection indirecte. L'un des grands traits, on y pense tout de suite, hein, quand on songe à la Cinquième République, à ses caractéristiques particulières, c'est le fait que le président tire une légitimité spéciale du fait qu'il est élu au suffrage universel direct. Ça, c'est le résultat de cette séquence historique très précise avec la victoire de Gaulle au référendum dans lequel il propose cette modification constitutionnelle.
So one episode directly linked to the conclusion of the Algerian War, which is famously present in the debates over this referendum for direct election of the president, is the attempt on de Gaulle's life, August 22nd, 1962, after which, I mean, he remarks in private, this was a sort of a convenient timing because it's part of what allows him to present to the public and to Parliament the necessity of securing his sort of how to say it, you know, his legacy of securing the institutions over which he exerted his authority in part by means of charisma derived, of course, from a heroic role in the Second World War. But it's hard to realize in retrospect, I think, exactly how controversial this amendment to the Constitution was. I mean, this is a decision which flouted long-standing Republican tradition, or thought to be a Republican tradition of anti-Bonapartism, anti-Caesarism, hostility to overweening personal power. It's uniformly contested in Parliament, provokes the only successful vote of censure in the history of the Fifth Republic. It's rejected by the Conseil constitutionnel. Léon Noël, a loyal Gaullist who was president of the Conseil constitutionnel, had to fight tooth and nail to convince his colleagues not to refuse to ratify the result of the referendum vote on this modification to the Constitution. In private, I think in his journal, he describes de Gaulle's conception of the law as Hitlerian in nature. So, this gives a sense, I think, of exactly how controversial and hard fought this transformation was.
Et cependant, de Gaulle obtient une très large majorité pour son référendum.
That's right. So the referendum, I think, succeeds with over 60% of the vote, which, compared to the 80% which approved the Constitution in September. It's perhaps a bit of a letdown. All the same, indeed, it does succeed. And in the legislative elections which follow, the Gaullist UNR achieves a massive victory, for the first time winning an absolute majority in Parliament. This is a period which has been described, I think, as the beginning of the Fifth Republic as a kind of parti état. So you really have a hegemony exercised by the UNR, which didn't exist in the 4 years between 58 and 62, when the Gaullists had a considerable majority and could rely on allies, other forces supporting it within Parliament, but its majority was not absolute. So from the end of 62, one sees the Gaullist state really at its kind of enter its apogee.
On comprend mieux, sans doute, pourquoi aujourd'hui, les circonstances de la naissance de la Cinquième République, entre mai 58 donc, et l'automne 62, font l'objet de très peu de commémorations en France. Elles ont peu de place, disons, dans la mémoire collective. Il y a une forme de refoulement. On célèbre beaucoup plus mai 68, par exemple.
Yeah, indeed, and this was part of my inspiration, really, in undertaking the research project for the dissertation, which became this book. And it's a process, I think, very well described by the French political sociologist Brigitte Gaëti as a kind of delinking or déliaison of the Fifth Republic from its origins. And so what you see, I think last October, President Macron celebrated, in a sense, the 60th anniversary of the Fifth Republic. But he did so not, of course, in May, or indeed even in September, but on October 4th, right? So the date of the promulgation of the Constitution, with a visit to Colombey, homage to General de Gaulle, and then a speech before the Conseil constitutionnel on his return in Paris. And so I think, what's really remarkable when you look at the history of this period is exactly how quickly this rather kind of sordid, criminal, unsettling episode of May 58, a summer dominated by whispers of putsch and pronunciamento, violent contestation, comes to be forgotten, comes to be occulted. I think this is it's a testament, in a sense, to a strategy of legitimation imposed in the first instance by de Gaulle himself and his associates, but which also found allies elsewhere on the political spectrum, on the part of a political class, that of the Fourth Republic, which had found itself, in a sense, unable to govern and is obliged to arrive at a kind of new consensus to keep operations moving, so to speak.
Le résultat de ces 4 années, c'est le cadre institutionnel français. La droite, aujourd'hui, se satisfait très bien de ce cadre. Elle n'est pas favorable, ni la droite, ni l'extrême droite, à un changement de république. Alors, de la part de la gauche de l'échiquier politique, c'est devenu un thème. Il faut changer de république. Les institutions ne sont pas bonnes. Il y avait une tradition de contestation de ces institutions, notamment depuis Mitterrand, qui parlait de coup d'État permanent, et puis qui, une fois au pouvoir, lui-même président de la République, n'a pas cherché à changer les institutions, tout en disant les institutions étaient dangereuses avant moi, elles le seront après moi. C'est devenu un thème politique, en particulier depuis la campagne présidentielle de 2012, où le candidat Mélenchon, du Front de gauche, avait dans le programme L'Humain d'abord un point très important qui était le changement radical des institutions, et c'est resté dans le programme de la France Insoumise en 2017. Est-ce qu'on peut revenir un petit peu sur les traits caractéristiques de ces nouvelles institutions par opposition aux institutions de la Quatrième République. Qu'est-ce qui est si différent?
Very broadly speaking, the two kind of crucial innovations are strengthening of the executive, as we've seen, introduced in 58, consecrated by this referendum in 62 on the direct election of the president, and correspondingly, really radical curtailment of the role of Parliament. What you see is actually a definition of the domain of law itself, which is constricted, dramatically constricted, and more broadly, a kind of devaluation of parliamentary expertise, which characterized the Third Republic, characterizes really a French Republican lineage in which Parliament, of course, is the voice of the people. It represents, in a sense, popular sovereignty in a kind of profound way, and instead the rise of experts, of technocrats, of unelected, which is often associated with the early years of the Fifth Republic. In some respects, I think it's a development which predates 58. I mean, and can be traced to different sources, but it's really it's thanks to the political crisis of 58 and the beginning of this new regime that a new class of experts are able to kind of profit and to install themselves at the commanding heights of the state.
Dans la manière dont vous décrivez le travail de Debré, père de la Constitution, pendant l'été 1958, pour élaborer ce nouveau texte, Debré et son entourage, Capitan et d'autres, il y a quelque chose, je trouve, de très suggestif pour comprendre les problèmes actuels, les problèmes qui déroulent de cette organisation institutionnelle. Vous racontez que Debré, quand il vient s'exprimer devant le Conseil d'État, fin août 1968, alors que le contenu de cette nouvelle constitution est encore secret, n'est pas encore public, il s'explique en disant « l'État est antérieur et supérieur aux représentants du peuple ». Ça, c'est quelque chose de fondamental, me semble-t-il, pour comprendre le déficit chronique de représentativité des institutions aujourd'hui, ce déséquilibre aussi fondamental entre le pouvoir de l'exécutif et le pouvoir du Parlement, qui explique que l'on se retrouve dans une situation où on a un président qui veut imposer des changements en profondeur, qui est en mesure de le faire institutionnellement, alors que, très clairement, une majorité de la population s'y oppose, en tout cas n'adhère pas à ce projet. L'État est antérieur et supérieur aux représentants du peuple. C'est une logique qui est toujours celle de la Cinquième République, me semble-t-il, et qui s'est imposée à la faveur des événements que vous décrivez, des événements de type insurrectionnel.
Yeah, I mean, I think absolutely, although I wouldn't want to underestimate changes that have since intervened or the circumstances of France today, which are, of course, I think, radically different from those which prevailed over the drafting of the Constitution, the founding of the Republic. But I think, yeah, there's certainly continuities, and this concentration of executive power and, if you like, anti-democratic disempowerment of Parliament are features of that settlement forged in national colonial crisis that, if anything, I think one can suggest have only been magnified in their effects since the years I described. You know, I think the other thing which I attempt to kind of call attention to in the book and which is perhaps of interest today is that this period, 58 to 62, of the founding of the Fifth Republic is also one of a real rejuvenation of left-wing theories of the state, interpretations of state power that one can kind of trace later, I think, in the better-known works, for instance, of Poulantzas, of Louis Althusser, a tradition of Marxist state theory which emphasizes the relative autonomy of the state from different class forces. And you know, to me, this is a kind of conclusion which dawns on many people as they attempt to grapple with the novelty of Gaullist power, which I think, you know, one has to recall was considered at the time by the Communist Party, and not only by the Communist Party, as a form of fascism, a form of unmediated dictatorship, but which I think demonstrated itself to be more complex and in the end more adaptable. And so I find rather convincing those who attempted at the time to understand both de Gaulle and his state according to a model of Bonapartism, derived, of course, from Marx's analyses of the end of the Second Republic, but which essentially sees the Bonapartist executive as a response to the inability of the ruling class to resolve contradictions between its different fractions. And so the president in this model is, as de Gaulle himself, in a sense, identified, a sort of arbiter, or attempts to arbitrate between all of the kind of contending interests of capital. So in the Marxist language, represents Gesamtkapital itself.
Mais de ce point de vue-là, il y a quand même une condition qui a radicalement changé. C'est la réforme faite par Lionel Jospin, au terme d'un référendum, qui fait que le président n'est plus au-dessus de la mêlée de la manière dont il l'était avant, puisqu'il est élu pour 5 ans et, qui plus est, les élections législatives suivent l'élection présidentielle. C'est-à-dire qu'il ne peut plus y avoir de décalage entre la politique du pouvoir législatif et celle de l'exécutif. Et dans cette organisation-là, on se demande un peu à quoi sert le Premier ministre. On a un président qui n'est plus dans une situation gaullienne, qui n'est plus dans cette situation jupitérienne à laquelle Emmanuel Macron fait beaucoup référence, alors qu'en réalité, c'est lui qui conduit la politique du gouvernement.
I'm completely in agreement with what you've said, and I think it points to a real paradox of the French presidency today. If you look back to de Gaulle's Republic, you see a president who ferociously and transigently is defending French sovereignty abroad, ostensibly without concession, and at home, thanks in part, of course, to the tremendous period of economic growth over which he presided, the Trente Glorieuses, is able to adopt a kind of benevolent, a paternalist posture above the fray of partisan scuffling. Now, of course, from 65, let's say, with the first election, direct election of the president, one sees Gaullism increasingly take on a kind of partisan character. And this is, I think, one important aspect of 1968, which is not always underlined. That is to say, in the legislative elections of June 68, you really see Gaullism take form as a kind of ecumenical political formation of the right. Which is, it loses in a way that mystique of being, as you put it, above the fray that de Gaulle so artfully maintained. But to come back to today, I mean, what I think is really striking, if you look at the French political system and the actual conjuncture, is you have a president who abroad really has his hands tied. I mean, obviously France's place in the world is no longer what it was 60 years ago, bound by European institutions, subordinated really to the kind of still the lingering hyperpower of the US, so diplomatically constrained. At home, still, overweening in his power, authority, and so forth, but hostage to an increasingly unfavorable public opinion, and embroiled in the kind of squabbles of parties. To me, it's a paradox that calls to mind a citation of Jacques Bainville, a great influence on de Gaulle, speaking out of Versailles. And as to say, it's a situation, or indeed a presidency, a form of executive power, trop faible pour ce qu'il a de dur, trop dur pour ce qu'il a de faible. That is to say, overweening at home, where you can observe expressions of frank disregard for Parliament, a fearless brandishing of 49.3, the article of the French Constitution, which is another key aspect, I think, of the 58 text, a deployment of repressive apparatuses and so forth, which is really quite singular in Europe. Abroad, a kind of castration or relative powerlessness.
Merci beaucoup, Graham Anderson. Est-ce que je peux vous demander de nous parler d'un livre qui, dans votre parcours, a été important et de le présenter en quelques mots?
The text that I lit upon is a work by a literary critic, in fact, a literary theorist and critic, Viktor Shklovsky, one of the founders of the school of Russian formalism, who had a remarkable life, who fought in the Russian Civil War, was exiled from the Soviet Union, ultimately returned, survived quite difficult periods of Soviet history, but who advanced a theory of literature in which the defining aspect of literary language, of poetic language, was ustranenie, or estrangement, making strange. So it's an idea which he introduces in a book entitled Theory of Prose, the first essay in which dates to 1917. And it takes as an example a short story by Tolstoy entitled Kostomer, which is a short story narrated from the perspective of a horse. And so the horse, has a lot to say, but among other things, the horse expresses his shock at being treated as someone's property. So here's the expression, this is my horse, it belongs to me. For Shklovsky, this is one example of how literature can serve to make strange, to defamiliarize social relations or concepts which we tend to take for granted. This notion of defamiliarization, I think you find in Brecht, you find in Roland Barthes, in the mythologie, but to me it's a very attractive definition of literature, or at least the kind of literature that I like, and I think it's perhaps not a bad way also of describing at least part of the historian's task.
Merci beaucoup. Gérard Noiriel, qui était l'invité de la première Grande H, disait que l'histoire, ça doit nous rendre étrangers à nous-mêmes, de manière à ce que nous puissions mieux nous connaître. Avec ce regard qui est le vôtre sur l'histoire de France, avec ce livre, vous nous permettez cette défamiliarisation qui est si importante pour prendre conscience des enjeux du présent. Merci beaucoup.
Merci à vous.